Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast dedicated to extreme cases of IS and LM. Let's start with the IS curve. The first extreme case is the one where IS is vertical. This means that the output is not sensitive at all to the interest rate. In other words, if we look at our behavior functions, the investment I is completely independent from the interest rate. Whatever the level of interest rate, investment will not be impacted. We are in the case of what we call the accelerator effect, which is a Keynesian situation where investment does not depend on the interest rate, but rather on the expectations or the optimism of entrepreneurs regarding the future. This can, for instance, be the case when the investment function depends on the expected demand YE, or when investment depends on the present demand Y. We can also have IS vertical if the investment only has one component, the autonomous component I0. The second extreme case is IS horizontal. It's basically the opposite of the Keynesian analysis here. Because savings and investment are a function of the interest rate, the output is, according to the classics, infinitely elastic to the interest rate. This means that the investment only depends on the interest rate. It is perfectly elastic to R. In this case, we say that the interest rate is insensitive to Y, because if Y increases from Y0 to Y1, R does not vary. Therefore, we will have an investment function in the form of R equals R0. Now let's remind ourselves about the notion of elasticity. The elasticity of investment to the interest rate is a way to measure the sensitivity of the investment to the interest rate. The formula is a ratio of two relative variations. The variation of investment, DI over I, and the variation of the interest rate, dr over R. This elasticity is negative because investment is a negative function of the interest rate. When we are in the case with IS vertical, the elasticity is equal to 0. On the other hand, when IS is horizontal, the elasticity tends to infinity. Overall, the characteristics of IS are determined by the investment function. And the characteristics of the investment function can lead to three different cases possible, depending on the elasticity of investment to the interest rate. If the investment is rigid to the interest rate, if the elasticity is 0, then a variation in the interest rate does not modify the investment. IS is vertical. This case can be possible usually for very high values of the interest rate. Indeed, when the interest rate is high, we can suppose that only the incompressible investment remains. For any negative value of the elasticity, then the curve is decreasing, and we are in the central zone in the graph here. Finally, if investment is perfectly elastic to the interest rate, if the elasticity tends to infinity, any infinitely small decrease in the interest rate would trigger an infinitely large increase in investment and therefore in output. IS is then horizontal. So here we can represent IS in these three portions. We also observe these three properties when IS is a curve instead of a straight line. Let's now look at the extreme cases of LM. Here, everything will depend on the elasticity of the demand for money with respect to the interest rate. First extreme case, when the elasticity is equal to 0. In this case, LM is vertical. This means that the demand for money does not depend on the interest rate. Concretely, households do not have any speculative demand. All their savings are held in the form of bonds. This is the classical vision of money. Money is neutral. It is a vehicle whose only purpose is to facilitate transactions. In the equation of the money demand, you can see that there is no speculative motive here. There is only L of Y. Second extreme case, when LM is horizontal, when the elasticity tends to minus infinity. We are in the opposite of the classical analysis. In this case, households have an absolute preference for liquidity. They prefer to have liquid money rather than bonds, probably because they expect an increase in the interest rate in the future. This situation is more realistic when interest rates are very low, close to 0, because in this case, agents can consider that the interest rate is lower than what it should be, and hence expect an increase. Until the rates increase, they will hold liquid money instead of bonds. In this situation, households will always demand more money for speculative motives. Therefore, any additional supply of money will be immediately demanded by the households. This corresponds to the Keynesian concept of liquidity trap. In this case, the equation of the demand for money is R equals R0. So, what is a liquidity trap? It is a situation in which the interest rate is very low, so low that agents consider it cannot go any lower. Because it cannot go any lower, the price of bonds is maximal, and agents sell their bonds. Remember from last year, the prices of bonds are negatively correlated to the interest rate. In any case, even if they don't necessarily sell their bonds, agents will certainly not buy more bonds. The demand for money for speculative motive becomes infinite. Households have an absolute preference for liquidity, and any additional supply of money would be immediately demanded by households. In this context, an increase in the money supply does not allow to reduce the interest rate. This is important because during recessions, one possible instrument is to undertake an expansionary monetary policy. Here, such a policy would be completely inefficient. The economy is in a liquidity trap, which will require unconventional monetary policies. Overall, the characteristics of LM are determined by the sensitivity of the demand for money to the interest rate. For most values of the elasticity, LM will be upward sloping. This is the central portion of the graph here. If we are in a liquidity trap, for low values of the interest rate, the LM curve will be flat. And if the demand for money is perfectly rigid to the interest rate, the LM curve will be vertical. This is the case for high values of R. In this case, the demand for money does not depend on the interest rate. Again, LM could be a curve instead of a straight line. Now, with our knowledge on the different extreme cases, we can represent graphically the two main schools of thought, classical on one hand and Keynesian on the other hand. In the Keynesian case, IS is very steep and LM is almost flat. In the classical case, IS is almost flat and LM is very steep. In the Keynesian case, the investment is not sensitive to the interest rate, and the demand for money is very elastic to the interest rate. For the classics, the investment is very elastic to the interest rate, and the demand for money is not sensitive to the interest rate. We use the expression Keynesian cross when IS is vertical and LM is horizontal. We can summarize all this by distinguishing three zones. The Keynesian zone, IS almost vertical and LM almost flat. The classical zone, IS almost flat and LM almost vertical. And the intermediary zone, which represents all the other more usual situations.